At the request of Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane or safe mode depending on their device. It's not sufficient to just put your phones in silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 5 on the agenda is the impact of Brexit on Ireland's housing market resumed. Today's meeting will involve resuming consideration of the impact of Brexit on Ireland's housing market, and on behalf of the committee I would like to welcome from the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government Mr David Kelly, Mr Paul Hogan, Ms Sarah Neary and Mr John Wickham to today's meeting. Before we begin, members, just a quick note on privilege. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. If you are directed that only evidence connected with the subject of these proceedings is to be given and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way to make him or her identifiable. I would now like to call on Ms Sarah Neary to make her opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank the committee for the invitation to attend today's meeting in relation to Brexit and the housing market. Unfortunately, Damien Allen, who manages the team within the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government responsible for the coordination of all matters relating to Brexit, EU and international business insofar as it relates to the functions of the department, is called away on an urgent personal matter, so can't be with us at the moment or this morning. In his absence, I'll deliver the opening statement and hopefully we'll be able to answer any questions you have on the issues. I'm Sarah Neary. I'm responsible for the building standards. I'm accompanied by my colleagues today, John Wickham, also with responsibility for building standards, Mr David Kelly, who has responsibility for homelessness and housing inclusion supports within the department, and Mr Paul Hogan, who led the development and coordination of the National Planning Framework. At the outset, let me set out the arrangements that are in place in the department in respect of Brexit. So we have a cross-divisional Brexit team, so that all of the department functions impacted by Brexit are represented on that team, and that they all have a forum to discuss Brexit-related matters. This is chaired by Damien, and Brexit-related matters are also kept under regular review by the department's management board. Externally, the department participates in the coordination structures established to facilitate a whole-of-government response. This includes the Interdepartmental Group on the EU, Brexit and the Brexit Coordinators Group. The department has been participating in the process of preparedness and contingency planning through these cross-departmental structures, and this process is ongoing. Insofar as the functional responsibilities of the department are concerned, it should be noted that Brexit issues arise primarily in relation to water, environmental cooperation, water and marine framework directives, planning, the EIA and the SEA processes, maritime spatial planning, franchise in relation to voting arrangements, and of course housing, which is the subject matter for today. The extent to which Brexit will impact on the housing market is of course still uncertain at this point in time. It will be determined by the outcome of the process around the withdrawal agreement, but also by the nature of the future relationship between the EU and the UK. However, our analysis to date suggests that the key issues arising for our department when it comes to Brexit and the housing market are around the following: the population and the housing projections, construction materials and homelessness. Firstly, in relation to population and housing projections, it should be noted that the National Planning Framework is based on mid-range, long-term demographic and econometric projections that do not factor in Brexit-specific impacts, largely because they are highly uncertain. The key variables for housing demand are the scale of and distribution of population growth, which in turn are heavily influenced by economic performance. In the long term to 2040, the NPF projects national population growth of around 1 million people and the need for at least 550,000 new homes based on continued modest economic growth. The NPF strategy seeks to focus growth on the regions in addition to the Greater Dublin area. In the short to medium term, there will be fluctuations in population growth and distribution, as well as in economic performance, and it is possible that Brexit could impact such variability. In this regard, it is necessary for a long-term strategy to project growth and influence distribution based on a trajectory that can reflect the net outcomes as a whole over a longer period of time. The key variable in population change in Ireland is net migration, which is highly volatile even over short timescales. Average net migration was approximately 20,000 per annum into Ireland between 1996 and 2016, but this ranged from a record high of 97,000 people in 2008 to minus 27,500 in 2010, a swing of almost 125,000 people in only 3 years. Clearly, Brexit has the potential to create further sharp swings in migration patterns. However, the NPF strategy is based on net migration of around 20,000 people per annum to 2040. There are, of course, capacity constraints in our economy in areas such as employment, housing and transport, which limit the potential for net migration to be sustained at very high levels. In the face of such uncertainty, however, the Department is currently planning based on the mid-range population growth scenarios set out in the NPF, while monitoring evidence of changes in this pattern. This means that the long-term housing requirement remains as projected, with short-term variation, for example, to address the shortfall in national output since 2010. Now turning to construction products and materials, an area which we are also conscious is very important in terms of Brexit. Construction products and materials are regulated by EU Regulation number 305 of 2011, which lays down harmonised conditions for the marketing of construction products, known as the Construction Products Regulation, or CPR. The primary purpose of the CPR is to break down technical barriers to trade in order to ensure the free movement of construction products across Member States within the European Union. In order to achieve this, construction products for which harmonised product standards are in force, or for which a European technical assessment has been issued, there's a need for a declaration of performance from the manufacturer and the need to affix a CE marking before the product can be placed on the internal market. In order to affix the CE marking, most construction products require the intervention of a notified body. Notified bodies are designated bodies that carry out third-party tasks, typically being product certification bodies, factory production control certification bodies and testing laboratories. The degree of intervention of a notified body in placing a product on the market is set out in technical specifications. Under the CPR, notified bodies must be established in a member state and be designated by that member state's notifying authority. The Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government is the notifying authority in Ireland for the CPR. Post-Brexit, UK manufacturers, distributors, importers of construction products being placed on the Irish market will need to continue to comply with the CPR. The European Commission issued a notice entitled Withdrawal of the United Kingdom and EU rules in the field of industry products, confirming this earlier in the year, which we disseminated to key industry stakeholders. All product suppliers who rely on a UK notified body to support their product declaration of for CE marking purposes now need to obtain EU notified bodies in preparation for Brexit. At present, the National Standards Authority of Ireland, or NSAI, is the only notified body in Ireland and provides certification services to many construction product manufacturers and are working with all the relevant stakeholders on the issues arising. As we do not yet know what the eventual outcomes of the Brexit negotiations will be, we are nonetheless planning in relation to construction products on the basis that the UK becomes a third-party country as of the 30th of March 2019. In this regard, it is important that businesses and stakeholders do the same. We will continue to enterprise and innovation, the National Standards Authority of Ireland, the Irish National Accreditation Board, and various industry stakeholders to support them in preparing for potential outcomes of Brexit. Finally, in relation to homelessness, it is the strong view that the significant increases in net migration would present a concern in relation to increased numbers of households having difficulty in accessing affordable accommodation. This highlights the critical importance of a number of the Department's programmes relating to increased delivery of all types of homes, social, affordable and private, strengthened regulation of the private rental market and the delivery of additional emergency accommodation for households experiencing homelessness. Naturally, it is the Department's ambition that increased housing output will be sufficient to meet demand, but we are also cognisant of the potential risk in this area and will be monitoring the situation very closely. Already, Budget 2019 includes significant additional funding for the provision of emergency accommodation, and the Department will be working closely with the local authorities who have statutory responsibility in this area. The Department is also working closely with other government departments, both bilaterally and through structures of the Homeless Interagency Group established by the Minister last year. In Dublin, where demand for housing is highest and where homelessness is at its highest levels, the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive, DRHE, is responsible for the delivery of homeless services across the 4 local authorities. Earlier this year, DRHE established a working group to ensure that robust responses are in place for families and single people presenting to homeless services with uncertainty around their eligibility for social housing supports. The main focus of the group is to ensure that a collaborative approach between homeless services and other statutory agencies and departments involved is in place across the Dublin region. Brexit is one of the chief issues under consideration by this group at present. In conclusion, the Department will continue to keep matters in relation to Brexit and the housing market under close review, and issues arising are being worked through. In addition to the issues that I have referred to above, the Department is liaising with colleagues in a number of government departments and public bodies on a range of other housing issues that may be impacted by Brexit, including issues relating to construction costs, the labour market, potential skills shortages in the future. We will, of course, continue this work. Finally, thank you again for inviting the Department here today. My colleagues and I are looking forward to engaging with you on, I suppose, the 3 issues highlighted: population and housing projections, construction materials and the potential impacts on homelessness this morning. And we're happy to answer any queries you may have.
Thanks, Sarah. Pat, I'll go to you first.
Great. Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Sarah, for the presentation. And I suppose if we all had a crystal ball here, it makes life a lot easier to try and predict what's going to happen. Maybe I'll first just talk in relation to the population and proposed population projections and the net migration of 20,000. And in the development of the National Planning Framework, I suppose we set a tighter population growth than what would previously have been set in the spatial strategy, and indeed we equally have restricted a headroom that there would have been greater headroom capacity within county development plans over previous periods. And in your presentation, you gave the example of how migration can swing from plus 97 to a minus 20, or plus 90 to minus 20, 100 and whatever it is, 25,000 swing in population growth over a 3 years. So we can see the impact that migration can have on our population figures. And then we try and predict what's going to happen with Brexit. And if we have a hard Brexit, we see our economy contracting, which normally would indicate that we have less people coming into the country. But in this case, it probably might actually work in the opposite, where we will see an increase in net migration coming into the country because of Brexit, even though our economy is contracting. And I'm not sure, I think there's a 6-year review in relation to the National Planning Framework and the population growth, so maybe a bit more information around that. I suppose the one area that you did focus on, Sarah, is the whole area in relation to products. And first of all, the certification of and the standards of products coming into the country. First of all, do we know what percentage of products are coming in from the UK that are used in the housing market? And they're currently certified through consumer product regulation and get this CE marking because they're part of the wider European market. But once the UK exit the European Union, these products that are currently coming in now have to be recertified, I think you were saying, by either Ireland or another European country. Or does it have to be done, all products coming into Ireland, do Ireland have to certify them now, or is it any European standard that relates to the products? And then maybe a bit of clarity around the implications of that. You didn't mention the implications of tariffs and the cost of these materials coming in. Do we know what tariffs will be applied to these in relation to a hard Brexit? And what's the implications on the cost of delivering housing at the end of the day? And the other area that wasn't mentioned, I suppose, is the whole movement of labour in relation to a hard Brexit. How do you feel that's going to impact on the housing sector? And finally, you did mention homelessness, and there's no doubt about it, if we end up with a higher net migration, it's going to add to the pressure that's already there on the homeless crisis. And while I'm clearly aware that there are services there to try and eliminate homelessness, I suppose, just what are your views on what additional measures could be put in to try and deal with the worst scenario in relation to a homeless crisis being escalated due to a hard Brexit? Just a few comments.
Thanks, Pat. Sarah?
Okay, thanks very much. I might hand over to Paul first on the population stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Just the first point is in relation to the projections in the national planning framework being different to the national spatial strategy. They're actually not that different in a sense, in that I think the spatial strategy was talking about 1.2 million people over 20 years, and we're talking about a million people over 20 years. So there isn't a huge difference. I think one of the problems with the NSS was that after the 06 census, in the absence of very strong regional plans, local authorities looked at the short-term trend from 02 to 06 and took a view that the sort of very, very significant growth that was experienced between 02 and 06 would continue. And then that gave rise to very ambitious plans in the later part of the, I suppose, the noughties, which meant that by kind of 2010, most of the plans that were extant bore no reflection to the prevailing circumstances post-2008. So that kind of caused, I suppose, a mismatch then that's existed up until this very day in relation to what local authority plans have kind of anticipated and projected, what they've based it on. So they departed to some extent from the NSS, which was the problem, and that departure wasn't corrected until such time as now, when we've put the NPF in place. So the NPF is trying to be longer term, and I think you've correctly identified the kind of formal review every 6 years, which is true. But I think, given there's so much uncertainty and there's so much commentary, and also even compared to years ago, there's so much information. I think someone was saying earlier that you just have to. There's so many things to read, so many reports, the latest information, that we've realised that we need to keep those projections under constant review. So we've talked to the ESRI about trying to put in place a kind of an ongoing level of analysis that would cause us to have kind of short-term variation, and then take a view as to whether it is impacting on the long term. Because I think the long term is, until strong evidence suggests otherwise, the long term will remain fixed. But we are going to be very mindful of it in the short term, because we know there is the capacity for local authorities in particular to feel very strongly. So I think in relation to the impact of Brexit on migration, I think again, a lot of commentary would suggest, and a lot of evidence would suggest, that Dublin in particular will remain attractive for people coming into Ireland, and cities are attractive to migrants. That's the reality. So I suppose our strategy in relation to this is twofold. We are very, very strongly trying to support our regional cities and towns, and the National Planning Framework Strategy backs the other cities in addition to Dublin. And it's a very fine balance. We have to be very careful about the fact that Dublin is globally important to Ireland, but then again, we really do want to grow and expand the role of the other cities and indeed other towns. And we're, in these current weeks, we're actually finalising the Urban Regeneration Fund, which was targeted at larger towns and cities to encourage investment. To make them more competitive and more resilient to the effects of a potential Brexit-induced recession or downturn, or whatever we want to call it. So I think the bottom line is we may see more regional variation in population projections or growth, and we have to try and target measures to address that. Just the final thing I'd say is that we obviously calibrate anything we do, with the ESRI or whoever, against CSO information, and we do participate in a CSO group, an expert group that previously met in relation to long-term population and labour force projections. and is due to meet again, I think starting this Friday, on regional population projections. So I think, we've watched very closely and influenced, I suppose, that discussion in relation to regional variation that might be impacted by Brexit, because clearly we obviously are concerned that the risk that's there for particularly the border and North Midland counties, as opposed to maybe the cities which have proven more resilient.
Thanks, Paul. Sarah?
Okay, then just in relation to the products, I suppose, look, at Ireland is a small open economy. We've a strong trade between ourselves and the UK in terms of construction products. There's a number of different statistics out there. The CSO, PII have statistics around imports and exports into Ireland from the UK. I suppose we don't collect those or publish those numbers, so I can't give you the percentage in terms of the construction products used just in the residential or in the housing sector, but it is significant, and any change to those conditions, either the availability or additional tariffs, or indeed even currency fluctuations, translate into a knock-on effect on construction costs, and we're very conscious of that. And obviously that's the tariffs, and as well as that, the labour movement, the common travel area, they're all key issues in terms of the negotiation of Brexit. But for our department, I suppose the one function that we have is that we are the notifying authority for the CPR. So just to explain that, all products covered by harmonised standards, all construction products covered by harmonised standards must be CE marked when they're put on the Irish or any other European state. Nothing is going to change on that. So for products that are being imported into Ireland that relied on a UK third party to certify them. So products on the market today coming from the UK may be relying on a UK notified body. For them to continue post a hard Brexit, they would have to have a third party that's notified in some member state. It doesn't have to be Ireland, it can be any member state, in order to put products on the market in Ireland or elsewhere on the member states. So there is a change for them in the situation of a hard Brexit. Now, in that, so as the notifying authority, if a UK notified body wants to establish themselves in Ireland, they apply to the likes of ourselves. We rely on the Irish National Accreditation Board to accredit them for specific standards and specific areas, whether it's factory production control or testing, or whatever it is that they want to do. We have had a number of applications from UK bodies. The Irish National Accreditation Board are working with them at the moment, some of them, and once they've been accredited for whatever standards they're requesting, they come back to us. There's a number of conditions around insurances and establishment in Ireland, and a number of other kind of terms and conditions. And once everything is in order and we're satisfied, we recommend their notification to Europe. There's a process there, and if all is successful, then they become a notified body in Europe, based in Ireland, and then they can carry out those functions for their UK manufacturers and place the product in Ireland. None of them have been, but the progress is good, and that is they are going through the accreditation process at the moment. Now, I know where you're going, in that, what happens if it is a hard Brexit at the end of March. It's something that we're putting to the Commission in terms of a transition arrangement separate from the withdrawal agreement. And there is a bit of a precedence for this, in that when the CPD, when the Construction Products Directive became a regulation back in 2013, there was a similar, cut-off point, the 1st of July 2013, presented a new set of rules for construction products. And at that time, the Commission did allow and were clear about if you don't change your product, or if the standards relating to your product don't change, then you can continue to put that product on the market up until the time of your next audit or your next batch of the product. So we are querying with the Commission at the moment as to what kind of a transition arrangement may apply in the situation of a hard Brexit.
So basically every single product eventually, in the light of a hard Brexit, will have to be recertified by a notifying authority.
Only in its normal, it will have to rely on
another body to certify it.
Whether that's in Europe or in mainland Europe or in Ireland, yeah. It'll have
Every
to be
single product that's coming in. With a CE marking today will have to be basically recertified at some stage, whether there's a transition period or non-transition period, but every single product will have to be recertified.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the rules haven't changed.
No, the rules haven't changed, but they still will have to go through.
And there are a number of bodies in the process of establishing themselves in Ireland.
Okay.
Can I just ask a clarification that what the accreditations body's remit really is? What, you know,
so they check their processes to ISO standards to make sure that they meet the requirements as set out in the construction product regulation. So it's all about consistency of production, that whatever you declare in terms of the performance of the product, that you can repeatedly produce that. And there are varying degrees of third-party intervention depending on the safety implications of the product, really, and they're all set down.
perfect. Victor?
Well, firstly, I want to thank Ms. Neary and our team here today. And I suppose, you know, there's so much uncertainty there. Everyone says that about Brexit. But I'm conscious here today that we're here really to discuss Brexit and really its fallout and potential impact on the Irish property sector. And that's very broad. And I'm also conscious that we are the Committee for Housing, Planning and Local Government. So I'm going to just deal with 2 or 3 issues. I suppose there are many main challenges, both in terms of Brexit, but also in terms of our own national issues in terms of housing. So, I mean, I'd just like to focus on 3 issues, you know, on these 3 challenges, really. You know, the increase in housing supply. I mean, we have a national problem, not to talk about an international problem, you know, so the increasing of housing supply, I want to touch on that for a moment. I also want to talk about the cost of construction. And that is, of course, linked into a whole load of issues around this. And then also the infrastructure deficit and the constraints in terms of infrastructure that are frustrating development per se, right across the spectrum in terms of jobs, in terms of housing, in terms of affordable housing, right down, at all pillars down, where you have a lack of proper, decent infrastructure. Of course it's going to impact on construction, all aspects of construction. And so they're the 3 issues I want to talk about, but I'm going to tease those out with a few questions. But I want to firstly go back to Ms. Neary, your presentation to us this morning. It's not numbered, but I've counted out the page, so I'll draw your attention to its page 5 here. And you say the NPF, the National Planning Framework Strategy, is based on a net migration of around 20,000 people per annum up to 240. Or should I say the NPF says that, so that's not in dispute. But then you go on here to say there are, of course, capacity constraints on our economy, such as employment, housing and transport. I've said that already. Everyone knows that, which limit the potential for net migration to be sustained at very high levels. In the face of such uncertainty, however, the Department is currently planning based on its mid-range population growth. Can you tease out what you mean by mid-range? What figures are we talking about there? Because the reality is that we, of course, will have more people wanting to come to the cities. We, of course, will have more people wanting to come to Dublin along the East Coast. That's where we have industry. It's where most of our commerce is done. And yes, the National Planning Framework talks, and I'm very supportive of the National Planning Framework. And yes, it sets up objectives and targets to have infrastructure and development across the country. But, you know, there's a lot of aspiration there. But going back then on those key areas, because you're ultimately from the department, you know, can you tease out for us, you know, how we're going to increase housing supply over and above to meet the demand? But it ties in with our own demand, our own demand. And I'm more interested in the social and affordable aspect of that as well. And then how are we going to address this thing of lowering the costs of construction? So we know of the potential tariffs that are going to come about as a result of Brexit, additional forms of taxes, how we're going to process, a very high percentage of our construction and building products are coming in from the UK. We know that. Everyone tells us that. But how are we going to address all of that? Because that's going to have a huge impact. Based on our economy and the size of the country, most of that stuff is coming through. So, how are you going to envisage that, or what do you plan in terms of your department? Because, no disrespect, and I take this as it is, it's no disrespect to anyone here, but everything was in here, we sort of know. But I'm more interested in hearing more what proactive things are going to happen. And I know it's very hard to plan it precisely because of the uncertainty of the whole Brexit issue. And then finally, in terms of national infrastructure and this potential of a national infrastructure authority, you would have knowledge, or your officials would have knowledge of the need and the desire to have a national infrastructure authority. But that's an important aspect of all of that. So I know that you might be prepared for all of this today, but you may come back to the committee. But I think they're the criticals here. The increasing of a housing supply, the cost of construction, but more importantly, acknowledging the high cost, how we're going to come down on that, the serious impact in terms of tariffs and additional taxes post-Brexit, because that is, someone has to pay. At the end of the day, someone has to pay for it. So I'll leave you with those, and you've covered in detail. I'm not going to go into any great detail in terms of the construction of materials. You've spoken to that. You've spoken about that earlier. So if you could just sort of touch on a few of those issues, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, I might hand over to Paul in terms of the MPF and the figures there, if you don't mind, Paul, and then I'll come back on the cost of construction.
Yeah, okay. I think you wanted to tease out a little bit more just what we mean by the mid-range in terms of population projections and scenarios. Well, it's not just a demographic scenario, it's also an econometric scenario. So it looks at the mid-term economic review, the prospects for the economy as well, and distributes population with regard to both demographics, the econometric modelling, and places around the country. So, I mean, it makes assumptions like any model or any assessment, but they're assumptions, I suppose, that are grounded on likely reality. And what I would say is, when calibrated against, say, the CSO, the Central Statistics Office, mid-range scenario for long-term population and labour force growth, it more or less correlates with their mid-range scenario, which is what we described as, I suppose, the traditional most likely scenario. And there's a couple of underlying things in that. The first is our population. When you look at births and deaths, for example, our population is below replacement levels. We're not. If you had zero net migration, our population would be slowly falling, and that's typical of developed economies. I think the birth rate needs to be about 2.1 for replacement. We're at about 1.85 or thereabouts, and slowly falling. So we're dependent on migration for population growth, and typically, I think, again, in very general terms, approximately half of our migrants over a long period would tend to be returning Irish people who may have lived abroad or started their working careers abroad. And the other half, obviously, would generally be people from elsewhere in the EU and the rest of the world. I think that the reality is that capacity to accommodate people in the country is with a sort of a level of economic growth and a level of employment that we have now is not endless. And clearly, if that were to extend beyond the sort of figures we're talking about for a protracted period of time, clearly there wouldn't be the capacity to, for there to be employment for people, for there to be, somewhere to live, etc., etc. So, there's obviously a kind of an economic equilibrium or a sort of a limiting factor in relation to that, and that's the sort of considerations that are taken into account when projecting or when making assumptions for a model to make a projection into the future. So the figure of 30,000 is considered to be a sort of an upper range, and bearing in mind, I mean, these are kind of, in projection terms, these are straight line figures. So you're presuming, 20,000 every year for the next 20 years, or 30,000 every year for the next 20 years. And those sort of patterns aren't the reality. So there will be fluctuations. It may be lower in the short term, higher in the middle part of the period, and then lower again. That's the nature of our economic cycle. So all of those things considered, it's a kind of it's a mid-range projection, averaged out over the period, and that's the way it works. If you take the 30,000 figure, for example, and just compare that against what happened in the past, that figure wasn't exceeded for more than about 6 years during the previous boom, which we wouldn't necessarily expect to be replicated. But then again, it could be. But as I said, it was exceeded for about 6 years, and when put into a kind of an average 20-year period, it works out about 20,000. So, based on the information we have, it's felt that that's the most prudent way to go. Just say a short word then in relation to infrastructure and infrastructure planning. I mean, part of the logic of the MPF is trying to identify where investment can be influenced and where obviously people and employment can be influenced in terms of decisions for employment and for housing. And I suppose a sustainable level of investment in infrastructure has been set by the Department of Finance and Public Expenditure at about 3.5% of GDP, or GNP star, which is our GDP equivalent. And that's seen as sustainable for the period to 2027, and the National Development Plan is based on that level of investment. It's higher than the European average. The European average, I think, is about 3% of GDP. And I suppose the objective of the NDP is to target that investment where it can be most effective and where it can deliver growth that will make a difference for the regions as much as for Dublin.
Yeah, so maybe to go back to the cost of construction, look at labour and materials affect their market costs, and any changes to those affect the cost of construction. The negotiations on trade tariffs or labour movement in relation to the common travel area are absolutely critical. I suppose in terms of our department's role, the key area for us is to make sure that any establishment, any organisation that wants to establish itself as a notified body, that we are as helpful in the process and explaining the rules to them, and whether it's a transfer over from the UK or a new body, that we're as clear and as open about our notification procedures. And that is what we've done. We've published all our notification procedures. Any queries are dealt with promptly, and we work very closely with the NSAI, INAB and the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation on that. And we know that they're ramping up in terms of delivering their service, which is an integral part of that notification procedure. We are making all our industry stakeholders as aware of whatever is developing as much as we can in terms of any of the information that we get from Brussels. We are disseminating out to our key stakeholders, and I suppose the main one there was where the EU said the rules will not change. The CPR applies post-Brexit in the same way. So as much clarity as we can give, we're disseminating out so that people know what they need to prepare for. I suppose then so after that, whatever effect Brexit has on cost or labour, we're going to have to deal with. But I suppose in terms of delivering housing, construction cost is one element of delivering housing. Land, financing, professional fees, levies, all that, that's what makes up the entire cost of delivering. And I suppose we're doing a number of things on those. In terms of what Paul is talking about there, and the compact growth that's required in Dublin City and other large urban areas, we did revise the planning guidelines for apartments earlier this year. They improved the economics of apartment building, and we're seeing an increase in planning permissions and delivery on that front. There are a number of measures around affordability being brought forward at the moment. The Service Sites Fund, which also complements, I suppose, the delivery of affordability, and the Help to Buy schemes and the Rebuilding Ireland Home Loan all kind of support that area of bringing down costs. The Land Development Agency and that whole area of strategic land management and of the state portfolio, that's all in an effort to reduce the overall delivery costs, and the Home Building Finance Ireland initiative as well. So I suppose we're doing what we can across the broad delivery issues.
No, that's grand. Thanks, Sarah.
Good Chair, and I won't delay because my voice is very compromised today. I think Pat certainly covered the area I was going to. I suppose specialising in the sense of the cost of materials, the importing, given the fact that we're an island nation and we do very much rely on the UK. And just to follow on the answers that you did give, Pat, I'd like to know how much engagement you have had with industry surrounding these new accreditations. Do industry understand the implications of it, that there may be, and in terms of the cost implications, who is ultimately going to end up paying for this? Is the I suppose businesses in Ireland going to end up suffering as a result of this new, what would seem to me, a very extreme accreditation that's required?
Thanks, Senator. Maybe I'll ask John to answer that.
Yes, thanks. I suppose in the lead up to the implementation of the Construction Products Regulation, we had intensive engagement with the industry, and we produced information leaflets, etc., for distribution amongst the professional bodies and the stakeholder groups, which would be, I suppose, the economic operators that are affected by the Construction Products Regulations, be largely the manufacturers, the importers and distributors. So we got good coverage at the time. The rules are very clear under the Construction Products Regulation. We also actively work with the professionals who are specifying products. So those would be the registered architects, building surveyors and engineers, who would be signing off on the materials which are incorporated into the construction works. And at the end of the day, what we're interested in is that those products are quality and fit for purpose. So in terms of the dynamic that exists between the certification of buildings and the placing of products on the market, we have, through our regulatory system, we've placed a value on the Declaration of Performance, which is a key output from the Construction Products Regulation. It's the obligation on the manufacturer to declare what his product can and cannot do in terms of common technical language that is readily understood by everyone involved. And I suppose in targeting the end user with a lot of our seminars and information, we emphasise to them to ask their supply chain for the DOP, the Declaration of Performance, make sure that they're prepared for eventualities, because it's a Declaration of Performance by which they will rely upon to sign off on building works at the end of the day. So it's quite an important legal document. I suppose in terms of the notification to stakeholders, which was issued earlier this year by the EU Commission, we have distributed that information out to all within our contact list. We have had several individual engagements with trade associations on getting a better understanding of the impact it would have for their membership. And I think the rules are, as they're stated, are pretty clear in terms of having business continuity. Those Irish manufacturers that currently engage with UK notified bodies will need to be conscious of making preparations to allow for business continuity should a hard Brexit occur. and equally, I suppose, the manufacturers that come from the UK who are importing products into Ireland will also have to ensure that they have a notified body that is, I suppose, a legal entity within an EU member state. So in terms of the NSAI, they have established a dedicated Brexit unit that is looking at the impacts of their stakeholder group, the construction stakeholder group, the manufacturers, and seeing where there's other measures possible where they can expand their service to be able to accommodate some of the Irish manufacturers that are looking for essentially a recertification. So that's something that they will have under review. The current scope of accreditation, they are the only notified body that that we have designated ourselves as the department. But as Sarah mentioned previously, there is an interest from a cohort of UK notified bodies to enter the Irish market, and that will be assessed in due course.
Is it your contention that the bottom line, the cost of construction, is going to increase as a result of a potential hard Brexit?
Well,
I don't think we really can comment on that at the moment. We just keep monitoring the situation at the moment.
Well, I actually think you should comment on it.
I suppose we have...
Markets fluctuate, that's kind of
Yeah, but you
looking
see,
into a whole
with respect, Chair, do you have any outside experts advising you? Is this all in-house, or have you retained any experts from outside professionals to actually advise the department in your preparation?
So I suppose there's a lot of publications around it. We're keeping abreast of what all the stakeholders are saying, but I suppose the resounding narrative is that this is all uncertain. And
I accept that.
And I suppose, but it would, I suppose it
Put
makes
it
the
another
point
way.
that...
I accept it's uncertain, but we are being told that the government, through yourselves, are preparing for a hard Brexit border. And, you know, the logical conclusion to that is that you would have an end-game preparation plan with costings. So it seems now that you don't.
No,
Sarah, just to let you know, we have...
That's the question.
Yeah, Martin, I just want to clarify, because Sarah was filling in for somebody this morning last minute, so she might not have seen the pack. We do have some information from the Department of Business within our pack around competitiveness and that in the bulletin. So I don't know if you would have had a chance to have seen that, but we've written to the majority of departments.
Okay, well, maybe they can come back to us another day then. Yeah, well, I suppose it's, you know, you were talking about the economic model and the demographic model. I suppose my other question was what expertise from outside the department have you retained in terms of helping you calibrate and come to, I suppose, your figures? Or do you feel you have enough expertise within your own structure to make an adequate and acceptable assessment?
Sure. We did work with the ESRI, the Economic and Social Research Institute, during 2016-17, when the National Planning Framework document and the National Development Plan documents were being prepared. And we did have expertise retained from the ESRI for that period. However, we do realise that this is, you know, it's not something that we want to just I suppose leave behind or leave fixed and then come back to it in 5 years' time or whatever. And it's become very clear to us that this is something that's ongoing and needs to be constantly kept under review. So for that reason, we've gone back to the SRI and started to re-engage with them about how this work can be continued in a useful way, and that process is underway at the moment.
Okay. And Chair, I'd like to apologise for the sound quality from my end. Anyway. Okay.
Thanks. Jennifer?
Thank you, Maria. And I suppose just to agree with previous speakers, we all have the fear of Brexit now, and you know the construction sector is a major sector in the Irish economy, and it's employing over 100,000 people. in its industry that needs certainty as discussions of withdrawal agreements and future relationship agreements are ongoing. And that has been risen, and loads of people have said this to me on several occasions. It's the uncertainty, but also I think in the meantime the government needs to give a commitment on the public capital programme, encouraging local employment, and we also need to look at returning, like building local authority houses, because that at the moment is non-existent. And the other issue I'd like to bring up is that we can do more to attract our immigrants back to Ireland by adopting policies, which I believe are not there, that are friendly for those wishing to return. Obviously, our housing crisis impacts greatly on these immigrants, as well as foreign companies seeking to locate here over London. I recently had a conversation with a member of a prominent bank in London, and while many of their operations have moved here, ultimately our lack of housing has pushed them to move more operations to Frankfurt instead of here. So we need to look at the Frankfurt effort, and we need to look at our future and our competitiveness, because that's what's happening. Because of the housing crisis here in Ireland and the lack of build and the lack of houses, people are going to move to other areas. Companies will go to the Frankfurts and the areas where there is a very good supply of housing that they can use. And that's what it will boil down to. So I'm just wondering, could you answer some of these questions for me? Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Sarah?
Okay, thanks. Just, I suppose, on the uncertainty issue, we'd all love more clarity on this. What we are trying to be as clear as possible about are the rules that are in place and what Europe is telling us remains in place. And what we've done is, when we have clarity, like when we got the correspondence from Europe around the CPR rules, we disseminated that to all the stakeholders. The CPR will exist and will exist pre or post-Brexit for construction products going on the market here. In terms of the effect on cost, anything that affects the cost of materials or products and labour will have an effect on construction costs and delivery. But and these are key issues in the negotiation of a withdrawal agreement, both the common travel area and any trade tariffs. But for our particular area of responsibility in the notification process and that underlying certification of construction products, we are saying prepare for a hard Brexit, which means you have to use a notified body who's established in a member state, be that in Ireland or in Europe. And as John has mentioned, we've had a number of inquiries from UK notified bodies. They are in the process, or some of them are in the process of going through the National Accreditation Body. We have a process which we have on our website. Any queries that we get, we answer in a timely fashion in order to support that and make it as easy as possible for these bodies to establish in Ireland and to become notified bodies. So that's what we can do for the process. Paul, did you want to say something around the NDP maybe? Or?
Yeah, I think I'll just, in reverse of what you said there, we do agree that housing is a very serious competitiveness issue for Ireland, and that's well recognised. But the issue is that we face a very significant backlog that goes back some time. You know, it's not that it just happened overnight. And you know, only 5 years ago we were still dealing with ghost estates and issues around the country with regard to oversupply of housing in certain places. So there is housing available, and it can be provided in other parts of the country. You know, you mentioned Frankfurt, but you know, elsewhere in Ireland, it is possible to source affordable housing, and that's partly why we are backing, you know, regional Ireland and the regional cities in terms of the national strategy towards growth.
Housing. I mean, in general, we know that, and we have to be realistic here. We have a massive problem with lack of housing.
We are acknowledging that, absolutely.
Yeah.
But look, what I'm saying is that the Project Ireland 2040, you mentioned that the government needs a commitment to capital,
yes,
capital programme, and the Project Ireland project is overseen by a delivery board that cuts right across government. All departments are represented, and that body meets pretty much monthly at this stage. And there's a huge focus on ensuring that decisions across departments with regard to investment is focused on the right places and is focused on the places that can make a difference regionally. So if I was to just, you mentioned you know, employment in particular being important, and obviously that's agreed. And at present, the Department of Rural and Community Development is assessing bids under the Rural Regeneration and Development Fund, and there's been 300 applications, for all over the country, all parts of Ireland, and many of those proposals relate to local employment, and I think that's one of the things that's being assessed right now with a view to making a decision shortly. Likewise, on the Urban Regeneration Fund, our own Department, Housing and Planning and Local Government, are assessing those. And also the Department of Business and Enterprise has a Disruptive Technologies Fund, again with some element of regional focus. So there is a real effort to try and encourage jobs growth elsewhere other than Dublin.
Thank you.
Chair, thanks, and apologies for being late. I mean, in some senses, none of us know what's going to happen. So we could spend lots and lots of time speculating, but because we're not going to know what's going to happen until it happens, I think our conversation, as it was with Neary and the ESRI last week, was accepting the fact that we don't know what contingency plans can be put in place so that if X happens, B can be the response, and if Y happens, C can be the response. And I was very struck by the ESRI in particular last week because they were giving the committee very, very clear warnings in terms of the impact, particularly on private sector supply, if things go particularly badly in the negotiations, hard Brexit or not. I mean, they were giving us figures, for example, like 50% of key building components, like electrical components, pass through Britain, 30% of timber products pass through Britain. Obviously, there's the issue of the flow of labour and the cost of labour and the potential disruption to cost of finance. And if I understood the presentation right last week, for us, they were saying the biggest warning was factors that could slow down the supply of private sector housing. Right? Now, clearly the departmental officials can't tell us how much that supply is going to be slowed down until we see it. But what I'm not hearing either in the presentation, the written presentation, or the answers I've heard so far is if supply starts to slow down as we move through the Rebuilding Ireland and NDP targets, what contingency plans could be put in place or are being prepared to address that. So, for example, if you take the social housing targets of Rebuilding Ireland, there's a portion of those which are local authority approved housing body builds and acquisitions, and you have a very large portion which are private sector, short or long-term leased. Meeting those targets requires the Rebuilding Ireland targets to proceed as written in the document. If private sector supply starts to slow, that means meeting the HAP targets, the RAS targets, or the leasing targets could be affected. Is the department discussing, in that eventuality, shifting funding priorities to ramp up the direct provision of social housing by local authorities approved housing bodies by a larger quantum that's in Rebuilding Ireland? So that's, I suppose, my first question. Likewise, for example, in the overall housing system, while I don't necessarily agree with this way of looking at it, it is the government's policy, which is increasing supply overall will reduce cost and increase affordability. So again, if private sector supply is reducing, are there contingency plans, for example, to increase the level of investment in the delivery of affordable housing above and beyond what's already been agreed to absorb some of that shortfall in straight private sector supply? Because it seems to me, if there aren't those kinds of contingency planning discussions, and I appreciate some of those are government decisions rather than departmental considerations because they would require increased resources or shifting the allocation of resources. But can you give the committee any comfort that those are the kinds of contingency planning conversations that are happening with your department and between departments? Because my big fear is, whatever about people's views of Rebuilding Ireland, and we have different views in this committee, and we discussed it last week, it's not Brexit proofed. It was produced at a time and is relatively blind to Brexit, and I think that's a fair point. Likewise, in your own submission, or not your submission, but Damien's submission today, makes it clear that population targets, for example, in the National Planning Framework, don't take a hard Brexit or a significant Brexit-related increase in population movements into account. Construction 2020, again. So the core policy documents governing housing delivery are maybe blind is too harsh a phrase, but they were drafted irrespective of what happens with Brexit. And Sarah, even some of the comments you're making as I came in terms of apartment guidelines or in terms of the apartment standards and the land development agency, etc., they're all things that would happen anyway. They're policy objectives in and of themselves, as opposed to things that are being produced to Brexit-proof some of the negative scenarios. So I suppose my core question is, are there contingency plans being discussed and developed? Is there a particular focus on what the state will do if private sector supply is disrupted, and whether or not the state can step in either on the social side or the affordable side and increase investment to pick up the slack there. And I suppose, what comfort can you give us that that's where the discussion is at? Because I absolutely appreciate everything else is hypothetical. But the department and government still have to prepare for those hypotheticals, particularly given the very negative impacts that they could have on supply.
If you don't mind, I might tag on the end of yours because I have to go to the chamber for 12:30 and then business committee at 1. Just a couple of questions. Tom Healy of the Newry Institute last week mentioned to us, you know, we didn't really, and I'm not quoting him word for word now here, but in general, we've had a decade or nearly 2 decades of a dysfunctional housing market, really, but the lack of supply over the last couple of years didn't just happen. That came from a dysfunctional housing market, a blanket one, and that we can't just ramp it up in 1 year or 2 years. It is taking time. And bearing that in mind, the Rebuilding Ireland plan, I mean, we can't wait for the UK to make up their mind. We have to plough on what our intention is with this country, and Rebuilding Ireland is a moving document, and I presume is adaptable throughout that. But we did a lot of work in this committee around the cost of construction and that, and around universal design, especially when we talked about housing options for older people. And we estimated that the increased cost around universal design was about 3%, and we were doing a lot of work to kind of offset that down the line. I presume when we're looking at the cost of materials, and should they go up if there's tariffs introduced, or maybe they won't, and again it's a hypothetical question, I presume we're looking at other measures to offset costs somewhere else in construction, or you know, that we might look in those areas. We also mentioned about, and Owen mentioned as well about, you know, a lot of the materials that we import and export to the UK, in particular, wet materials is 50%, and as Owen said, 30% in wood. But Tom Healy also mentioned that we need to diversify quicker now away from oil and fossil fuels. And when it comes to the 2040 plan, Paul, in particular, what key infrastructure plans do you think now are of huge importance to push ahead with quicker than what was previously planned? And what projects are underway that you think will help us through this transition period? When it comes to some of the other things are kind of probably not within your department, when it comes to work permits, and I'm going to ask the committee if we can write to the Department of Justice in relation to that. Have we looked at anybody who is from outside the EU in the processing time which it takes to get a work permit here? And in relation to the skill shortages that we do have, and we know that we will have into 2020 and 2021, we've looked at a lot of new technologies when it comes to construction to try and diminish the amount of either physical cranes or Manitous or whatever it is on site, or a lesser workforce would be required on site with newer technologies that are required. And I was on site last week, I won't mention where or what here, but in order to speed up the process of construction with new technologies, are we looking at a wide range? Are we putting much into research into construction? Are we looking at other countries when it comes to technologies? I suppose it's probably more for the Department of Education or Business, but when it comes to apprenticeships, further investment is dramatically needed there when it comes to apprenticeships. We had chartered surveyors in as well, and they mentioned about the ongoing engagement they have with their members here and in Australia and in Canada, and keeping them abreast with what's happening here and encouraging, hopefully, to get them back here. What kind of work are we doing in retaining talent that we have here currently? I suppose it all comes down to viability in the construction sector and giving certainty and consistency over the next 10, 20 years. I know 2040 is trying to give some of that. You might just elaborate a little bit more around that. And Sarah, I know that a lot of engagement, I suppose like the 2040 plan, there was huge public consultation, went on for over a year. So when it comes to engagement with stakeholders on a regular basis, or roadshows that are happening, I know Department of Foreign Affairs is doing a huge amount there as well. What kind of work is the department doing in engaging with the relevant stakeholders or CIF? And then when it comes to, I had one or two other questions which are probably gone from my head now, but unfortunately I have to disappear, but I will listen back to it on the blacks. But basically around key infrastructure projects and the cost of construction are my two queries. And I know the latter is a hypothetical question, but as much as we can prepare, because I know the department is preparing for the worst case scenario all the way along, and there's a whole of government approach when it comes to this. But the key infrastructure projects are one that I'd really love to hear back.
Okay. Okay, so I suppose, Deputy O'Brien, just in relation to the reduction on the private sector supply, and absolutely that's something that the department are analysing and looking at the moment. We've got an internal group, a cross-divisional group within the department where we discuss these matters and tease them out and see where policy might go. But I suppose I'm not really in a position to say these are the following actions, but we absolutely are considering these issues and looking at it and reviewing the material that is being produced from the likes of the ESRI. I suppose the other aspect is we are constantly trying to capacity build within the local authority sector and the AHB sector to build more, and Rebuilding Ireland shows that commitment and that ambition, which will be helpful in a hard Brexit situation, and if that translates into a reduction in the private sector, at least the capacity is going in the right direction. And allows us that flexibility to shift around if necessary. And I suppose Rebuilding Ireland is a live document rather than a set of actions that stay stagnant over time. I suppose on that, and again, maybe it is a question for the Minister rather than the officials, but while I accept that, for example, the capital construction targets are set through to 2021, and the leased and private sector subsidised are set to 2021. So we know what the quantum of those are. I suppose what I'm wondering is, if things were to get more difficult than they are, is there a discussion about whether you can shift between those two so that, we're going to have 89,000 private sector units subsidised by the state throughout the course of Rebuilding Ireland through HAPRAS and leasing. We're going to have about 40,000 real social houses delivered by approved housing bodies and local authorities through builds and acquisitions. If Brexit starts to get very negative, and we're here in 2020 and private sector supply is slowing, one of the things that immediately does is it reduces the capacity of Rebuilding Ireland to meet its social housing targets in the subsidised private rental sector. Is there a discussion about, if that were to happen, can you increase the capital spend for real social housing to build and buy rather than the reliance on the private sector, I suppose? That's most definitely being discussed within the internal groups. But obviously any impact on capital expenditure is a matter for government. Sure, but it's certainly being discussed. In terms of the issues that the Chair raised around new technologies in the construction industry kind of as a whole, again, there's a kind of a broad picture, and then there's the areas that we have a kind of direct responsibility or a direct impact on. I suppose we are supporting the new technologies being developed for delivery, speedier delivery, through both the rapid delivery framework, which was established last year by the OGP, and also a tendering process that's underway at the moment through Dublin City Council for volumetric, or basically rapid delivery apartments, so that we support through kind of pull measures the industry moving forward to delivering prefabricated, a greater degree of prefabrication onto the construction site, so that we get a speedier delivery. And that certainly there's a developing market there, and there's a good response to that process, both within Ireland and in our neighbouring neighbouring countries. Paul, would you like to say some stuff on Project 2040 and the commitments?
Okay, I think just on the first set of points, I think it's a very difficult question, and I think it's very difficult to isolate the question of supply from demand. Like I think the reality is that we have we've a requirement to increase supply, and I think that the main thing there is that the commitments that are there to do that are protected, and that's the start point. But then to look at how that might be accelerated or further developed, I think we have the Land Development Agency, which I hadn't intended to get into a very big discussion about. I know that that's subject to other meetings, but the Land Development Agency will increasingly be to affect that change over time. Not necessarily, this year. It'll take time to ramp up, as has been said in other fora. But certainly, by the time these sort of issues manifest, we would expect that, particularly in the area of affordable housing, the Land Development Agency would start to make a difference. So just in relation to the key infrastructural plans that were mentioned by the Chair, I think, given that a lot of the growth, I think one thing that seems to be, it's both part of the overall NDP Project Ireland strategy, but it's also something that seems to be more likely, despite all the uncertainty of Brexit, is the fact that we do need to build up the capacity for increased housing supply in our cities and large towns. And there is an issue, with regard to mobility, and I think the biggest influence, to my mind, on I suppose, the capacity for densification or higher densities in terms of housing and the ability to provide more housing whilst maintaining a degree of amenity for people is urban mobility, or public transport, walking and cycling. And I know these things are very easily said, but there's a reality whereby we can see the massive success of something like the Lewis, where people will use it. They'll travel some distance to use it, for example, and indeed other reliable forms of public transport. So we really do need to ramp up our capacity to move people within our cities, because that underpins both the strategies we have anyway, but also any increased demands for housing and our capacity to provide more and more of it, of the type that's needed in the places that it's required. Because if we don't do that, we are left with the option of going further and further out.
Mick, do you?
Yes, just a question, Chair. It's a question both to the Department and to the reps from the PII, and it's on the issue of rent. So, as I understand it, what's being said is that if you have increased FDI into Ireland, particularly into the cities, particularly into Dublin, that the tendency of staff, the tendency of workers in those workplaces is not so much to buy, but is more to rent. Therefore, there's an increased demand for rental property, and unless there's a corresponding increase in supply, if it's left to the market without rent controls, which obviously I would support, you'll tend to have increases in rent. Now, the forecasts in relation to jobs and wages tend to talk about a range of potential job losses or a range of particular wage cuts. Where we'll get reports which tell us that there could be between 20 and 40,000 job losses in the event of a hard Brexit and what have you, right? Anything we've heard so far on the question of rent increases has tended to be very broad brushstroke. Rents will tend to increase, but there haven't been indications as to whether rents will tend to increase by 5%, 10%, 20% on foot. Are you in a position to give any more specific indication over and above the idea that you think there'll be general upward pressures on rent?
Apologies now, I don't have any. I don't have anything to add to that, but we can come back to you if you like.
Sure. Question to the Department as well?
That is the Department.
Sorry.
To the PII as well?
They haven't spoken yet. They're in the next session.
The next session.
All right.
My apologies. Sorry.
You know, you're okay. Maybe just before we finish up, I just want to go back to it's around something Owen spoke about there. In light of a hard Brexit, we're looking at a contracting economy, and at the same time we're talking about maybe net migration increase and possibly above the 20% because we will be seen as attractive from other parts of the UK. So you're getting probably a double whammy. And with a contracting economy, the fiscal space tightens. So it goes back to Owen's point about trying to, you know, and the private sector delivery will contract as well, which is putting greater onus on the state to deliver both social and affordable housing. And the fact that we will be in a contracting fiscal space and our failure as a state to find a sustainable off-balance sheet model to deliver both social and affordable housing, have we put any emphasis on trying to resolve that moving forward? And I suppose the great contradiction with Brexit is, in one sense, we should have, according to predictions, 40,000 job losses in a hard Brexit. So we should resolve our skills shortages fairly quickly in relation to the construction industries if we've 40,000 unemployed in light of a hard Brexit. So the whole thing, in fairness, is so hard to predict, and I can understand. But a few things are coming through. If a hard Brexit happens, our economy, everybody is saying, is going to contract. We could see net migration increasing above what it is at the moment. The two of them have a negative impact on the housing market, specifically in relation to the private sector. So the state needs to ramp up its delivery in a tightening fiscal space. The only way to do that is off-balance sheet, and we've failed to deliver a sustainable off-balance sheet to date. So maybe you could make some statement on that.
I think that's the kind of, I suppose it is that it's the least desirable scenario where we have, and that's what I meant about not separating supply from demand. But I suppose it's, you know, in a contracting economy, you wouldn't necessarily expect net migration to increase to the extent that maybe is assumed. The reality is that, you know, the attractiveness of somewhere like Dublin, for example, or maybe the other cities, if we're successful, which we intend to be, could be counteracted with maybe a greater impact, say, in the North Midlands or in the border region. And I think what we're likely to see, rather than a kind of an overall issue for the state, I mean, one of the kind of scenarios would be maybe greater regional disparity, which is what we're trying to counteract or work against. So in other words, you know, the cities remain resilient and attractive, but the maybe more peripheral parts of the country, particularly in the border regions, you know, become more challenged. And, you know, we've seen, obviously, lower skilled workers. Again, there's a lot of evidence from the previous downturn, you know, from 2008 onwards, that a lot of lower skilled workers would have migrated elsewhere, and not necessarily to the UK. I mean, to places like Canada, the Middle East, Australia. We're all familiar with that. We've 100,000 less construction workers now in the country than we had in 2007, and those people still haven't, you know, come back. They're obviously happily living elsewhere. So I don't think we can make assumptions that it'll be kind of even across the state. I think one of the things that will be important to us post-2020 is that there is a new cohesion framework in EU terms, and that's something that we have obviously an interest in as a state, particularly post-Brexit. And you know, one of the kind of key themes of European cohesion is to focus on border regions, because, you know, even if you don't have something like Brexit, between member states, the performance of peripheral regions or border regions tends to be lower than the rest of the state. And that's true in places like France and Germany as much as it is in our own situation. So, you know, I think we have a very strong case when you consider the fact that we are dealing with, you know, essentially what will be a third state or a third country, sorry, you know, as well as our border region, to focus on I suppose, a case for increased cohesion funding under the ERDF and on other funds. And another aspect of that, you know, post-2020 is they want to focus on metropolitan regions, which ties in very well with their own spatial strategy. And they also want to focus on tying what they call territorial strategies, in other words, regional planning as we would know it, to funding. So we've already kind of had the right sort of thinking around that. So I think we're in regional development terms, we're trying to look to other sources as well to counteract that likely kind of uneven impact of something like Brexit or in the future, which everything we're doing is trying to work against.
Okay. I would like to thank all the witnesses for attending today and engaging with the committee. I propose we suspend for a few moments to allow our next set of witnesses to take their seats. Thank you. This section is the impact on Brexit on the housing market resumed. In our second session today, we'll be meeting with representatives of the Property Industry Ireland. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome Mr. Tom Phillips, Mr. David Duffy and Mr. Mark Fitzgerald. Just a note on privilege before we start. I wish to draw your attention to the fact by virtue of section 17(2)(1 of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect parliamentary practice to that effect. Where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any persons or entity by name in such way as to make him or her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official either by name or in such way as to make him or her identifiable. I now call on Mr Duffy to make his opening statement.
Thank you. Chair, Deputy Senators, I would like to thank the members for inviting Property Industry Ireland to attend the meeting today. I'm accompanied by Tom Phillips, who is the Chair of PII, and by Mark Fitzgerald, who is a member of PII's Council. PII was established in 2011. One of the reasons for establishing PII was to have an independent and inclusive representative organisation for all subsectors of the Irish property industry. There are many different stakeholders involved in the delivery of property, from the professionals who design and plan development, developers and construction experts who build the properties, and funding bodies such as bank and investors and agents who sell and manage the properties. All of these stakeholders are represented in the membership of PII, and since the start of 2015, PII has been a sectoral organisation of IBEC. Our main mission is to be a trusted partner and provider of evidence-based information, policies and strategies for the property industry at a national level. Effective cooperation between the public and private sectors will be an important means of addressing the deficit in housing supply. We estimate that annual average housing demand will be 36,000 units for each year for the next 33 years. And I've attached details of how we reach that estimate, and we are preparing a briefing document on this. Due to the substantial pent-up demand that exists, there is a need to reach an annual output of 50,000 units in the short term. This estimate is higher than the projection underpinning Ireland 2040 and is based on age and gender-specific headship rates from census data, which suggests that the number of households in 2051 will be close to 2.8 million, a 60% increase on the 2018 level of 1.75 million. At present, we are building less than 20,000 units per annum. This deficit in supply is resulting in issues of affordability and availability of accommodation. And these difficulties are not confined to one segment of the market, but are across all tenures: owner occupancy, rental and social. It is the view of PII that the issues facing the housing market are independent of Brexit and need to be addressed regardless. It is often difficult to assess history as it is evolving, but it is our view that the Brexit vote of June 2016 has already had an impact on the property market. In 2016, Ireland was grappling with a housing crisis that had been accentuated by a failure in 2012 to appreciate the bulge in demographic demand that was likely to occur because of a combination of two separate trends: population growth since 2006, as evidenced in the 2011 census, and economic recovery resulting from the swift administration of austerity policies. In January 2018, PII published a report, Brexit and Ireland's Property Sector. The impact on housing and the property market that we've observed since the Brexit vote are as follows: a significant increase in overseas companies, particularly US companies, seeking to locate offices in Ireland and in particular Dublin. This is leading to a further increase in the demand for residential rental property, an increase in net migration levels into Ireland beyond what had been anticipated. On the other hand, Irish people who, at a generational point, normally move back from the UK have encountered difficulties in selling their houses and apartments in Britain, resulting in some tempering of the rise in Dublin house prices. Analysis by the ESRI suggests that the impact of Brexit will be negative on the overall economy, and what we've seen is that activity in the housing market tends to follow the overall economy. One of the main unknowns is what form Brexit and the future relationship between the EU and the UK will take. This adds to uncertainty about any of the impact on migration flows. If net migration reduces, then this will reduce demand for housing and slow the growth in prices and rents. However, this does not mean that our housing crisis will be resolved or that prices and rents would fall, as such uncertainties in future demand may lead to a decline in confidence, meaning less investment and less overall supply of new homes. However, higher net inflows would increase demand. Brexit, including a softer form of Brexit, does present some opportunities for Ireland to attract businesses seeking to maintain access to the EU single market. This has the potential to be both the opportunity for the property sector in Ireland, as well as a challenge, with an ongoing housing crisis and increasing prices and rents. Increased FDI flows highlight the link between the commercial and the residential property sectors. A concern is that an increase in demand for residential accommodation will result in higher prices and higher rents in the short run. Research has found that non-Irish nationals are more likely to rent accommodation when they first arrive in Ireland, and that the cost of accommodation is a key factor in the decision of workers to locate in Ireland. Businesses urgently need to see a better functioning rental market. However, the effect will not be the same across the country. Brexit-related FDI represents an opportunity to locate companies in the regions. While sentiment is difficult to measure, the international political environment may increase Ireland's attractiveness as a location. As a small country, we have in the past endured many of our citizens being drawn to make their lives outside of this country. Ireland, despite a potentially adverse Brexit and our existing shortcomings in housing and healthcare, has become a desirable country to return to or to come to live in. This may have a bigger impact on regional Ireland than is currently envisaged. The National Planning Framework is a critically important document providing a vision that will facilitate spatially balanced economic activity in Ireland. The availability of funding to support the investment in infrastructure envisaged in the National Development Plan will be crucial to the success of the MPF. Analysis by PII and by IBEC in the report Better Housing, which we published in June of this year, argues that comprehensive policy response is needed to ensure the supply of a minimum of 80,000 workers, which the construction sector needs over the coming years. More resources are needed to promote and develop apprenticeship opportunities, and the work permit system will need to facilitate increased migration of skilled construction workers from outside the EU. Ireland will need to put more effort into attracting workers from European countries and encouraging emigrants to return. Increased build of new social housing would help offset some of the uncertainty surrounding the market in the face of Brexit and would deliver much better value for money. This would also help deliver a more stable market and help avoid the volatility seen in the past. Uncertainty regarding Brexit and uncertainty and caution during any transition period will have a negative impact on the supply of housing. In order to build, the construction of new homes needs to be viable, but home builders also need some certainty about demand levels. In the short run, any increase in uncertainty may heighten caution and so have a negative impact on supply. In addition, Brexit-related uncertainty may heighten funders' caution and reduce access to funding for home builders, also negatively impacting on supply. Depending on the shape of the final agreement, there are also possible cost implications facing the supply of construction materials due to impacts on the supply chain. Business models may no longer be able to rely on just-in-time delivery. This, combined with potential additional tariffs, will add to the cost of construction. To summarise, our research paints a challenging outlook for the housing sector, even without having to deal with Brexit. We accept that it will take a number of years for the market to reach some form of equilibrium. Lack of supply in the residential property market, both rental and owner occupancy, now represents a key constraint to attracting FDI into Dublin and the rest of the country. Improving the viability of home provision is important for the broader economy. The viability of construction remains an important issue in many locations. Ireland's housing problems have now clearly moved beyond the social issue of our time and have become a risk to future economic prosperity. A properly functioning housing market is needed in order to underpin national competitiveness, improve quality of life, and to address the plight of people in need of homes. Ireland's housing market has not functioned normally for over 2 decades. Price and supply volatility have negative implications for home buyers, renters, and the property development sector. Attraction and retention of talent is now the biggest challenge facing Irish businesses. It concerns business leaders in most regions and sectors of the economy and is particularly acute in our main cities. Inadequate supply of affordable and quality housing is one of the main factors impacting on the availability of talent. Thank you for inviting us here today, and we are now happy to deal with any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Duffy. Victor.
Well, first I'd like to thank the panel for coming in and giving some time. I'm a particularly interested and a great supporter of yours. I've heard you before, David, on many occasions, so I suppose that gives me a slight advantage because you've posed a lot of questions over the last year or two and all the times I've come across you and also read and had correspondence from you. And I know earlier this year you had sent out on behalf of the PII, the sort of key messages, and I'm looking at them here, key solutions. And I suppose really I'm more interested now to see how we progressed in relation to that. So I'm just going to touch on a few. But first I want to acknowledge the important work you do, and I know you're affiliated to a partner with IBEC. And I think they've taken a really responsible view in terms of advocating and in talking and dealing with the challenges of Brexit as an organisation across all the wide gamut of areas they look after, and I think that's important, and they play an important role, and something that some people don't always recognise in terms of the work IBEC do, and I think it's important to put that on the record. I'm just going to focus on 5 key issues, because there were the 5 key issues that you raised in your presentation before, and I'm pretty aware of them, which were to facilitate the increase in housing supply. And I think you validly made something really important comment there, where you talked about, regardless of the Brexit, Brexit-proofing, rebuilding Ireland, whatever, we know we have a national housing crisis, and that's a problem, and you've addressed that here. But I mean, in terms of facilitating increased housing supply, second one, lower the cost of construction, and you have the benefit of being here earlier on, so you heard what the department's response, or lack of response was, or specific response was, and then addressing the infrastructure constraints. When I mean that, I want to hear about your commentary in relation to a national infrastructure authority or a similar body. There's one in New Zealand, there's one in Australia, there's one in Canada. There are a few models around the world that we could look at, but I'd like to hear what your view on that is, because infrastructure constantly comes up when you talk to people in IBEC about the rollout of addressing construction of anything, be it in terms of work, employment, or housing and homes for people. And then to go back on then to this regional development and spatial planning and the significance and importance of that, and how you feel that all fits in with the national planning framework. I reckon you're an advocate of the national planning framework from what you've said over the last few months. And then finally, in that area of increased competition, and that's a really important factor. And one other issue that we haven't heard, and maybe enough about in this discussion, is the shortfall of skills in the construction area, and that brings challenges in terms of new people coming in, the movement of the labour market, apprenticeships, trainingships, all those areas of bringing people who've left the country who have skills, but also people that we could upskill and train, and all the challenges that go with that. So I think there are enough of the areas to go on, but I think the reality is they're key issues. And I suppose we really want to see in terms of key solutions. But more importantly, you might comment, and I don't mean this to be unfair, but you have the advantage, you were here earlier, you heard the responses from the department, and you might like to add to that or address some of those issues in the context of your own paper. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pat, and thanks both for the presentation, but also the submissions. I suppose, look, my questions are kind of similar to the questions I asked in the last 2 sessions, both the department and the ESRI and the Nevin Institute. And it's really more to do with contingency plans, accepting the fact that we don't know how things are going to pan out, and that we could spend a large amount of time speculating. I suppose the real issue is everybody knows there are potential negatives, and like the ESRI and Nevin, you've rightly pointed out the potential impact on cost, both cost of finance, cost of materials, cost and supply of labour, and therefore the supply of private sector homes in particular. I'm very encouraged by a number of your recommendations, obviously one, increasing the build of new social housing. But I suppose it's not just the social housing bit, it's also the affordable housing, because if we have a reduction in any way of the private sector supply, that is also going to impact on affordability, irrespective of one's views of the relationship between those two. So my questions are as follows. From your engagement with government, do you get the sense that the contingency planning around housing and housing supply has been given the same level of priority as, say, jobs or trade or other aspects of the post-Brexit fallout? My own sense is that there is less of a focus on housing and the disruption that it could have to housing, and that's something I'm concerned about. Have you been involved in any way with the department or with other sector organisations in discussions around the contingency planning? So not the monitoring or the assessment of the risks, but what kinds of changes would need to be put in place to deal with that? And then specifically in relation to the paper you've attached, one of the things you're talking about is reducing costs, right? And reducing construction costs. And for me, one of the concerning things is, in fact, our construction costs currently aren't bad. The Housing Agency study published earlier this year shows that they're broadly comparable with comparable European member states. It's the non-construction development costs are the things that are really causing us difficulty, whether that's land, finance, the combination of taxes, etc. So specifically, because if you look at the Institute of Chartered Surveyors of Ireland report, for example, about apartment costs, what's clear is they make about 7 recommendations for reducing costs. And even if you did all of those things, we would still have a viability problem in terms of delivering apartments, for example, at prices affordable for families under €80,000 a year. So specifically, I suppose, other than just saying we need to reduce costs, how would you do that? Which cocktail of policies would you prefer to see? And do you think they would deal with the viability in a benign Brexit, post-Brexit scenario, and more importantly, in a malign post-Brexit scenario? And apologies for the sniffling.
Thank you. I think many of the issues raised in the questions are interlinked. I think it is important, given the projections that we've prepared and what we're seeing in terms of output, that we do increase housing supply, and that is an increase of affordable housing supply. And I suppose that is in itself interlinked with the issue of maybe not so much the cost of construction itself, but the cost of delivery. As the Deputy says, the Housing Agency work does show that Irish construction costs are very similar to European construction costs, and it's the additional costs on top of that that are impacting on affordability and viability. And our view is that in reducing the cost of delivery, given that the costs of construction are broadly similar, we need to look at those additional costs and be prepared to tackle some of them, looking at can measures be put in place with regard to the cost of funding, can something happen on levies, but also looking at the issue of the impact of VAT on the cost of delivery, and could VAT be reduced even for a time-limited period to allow to help the viability of the delivery of homes and allow affordable homes come into the market. We've also been supportive of the idea of a national infrastructure authority, and I might let Tom deal with that at the end. And it is true to say, yes, Ireland as an economy is facing increased competition. I think Brexit is to some extent highlighting that, because Ireland is being looked at as a location, as it always is, but is particularly at the moment being looked at as a possible location and being compared to other EU locations. So the impact of rents and house prices on competitiveness is probably particularly in focus at the moment as people look to where they are going to locate their functions and their jobs. With regard to the contingency plans, I think a lot of the focus has been on the cost of construction and the cost of materials and the skills and the impact on those, because I think, as we say in our opening statement, the housing market issues are there independent of Brexit. There is a focus on the housing market issues, and that focus will have to remain regardless of whether there is Brexit or not. Maybe if Tom wants to talk about the infrastructure authority.
Thank you, Deputy. On the issue of the infrastructure, that is a policy that we've been promoting for some time, because just take Australia. Australia is 110 times bigger in land mass and has a population 5 times our size and has a single infrastructure authority. We have a myriad of different competing forces looking for different funding. whether it be the second runway in Dublin Airport, the National Children's Hospital, etc. There's a book produced in Australia. We open on page 7. It was come out in February 2017. And page 7 says the most important piece of infrastructure that we need to promote in Australia is a road it's the M4 between Sydney and I think a place called Parramatta. In Ireland, that book doesn't exist. We have too many agencies, each with legitimate claims on our infrastructure, but we need one coordinating force to bring it together. It's not a creation of another Quango, but it's just bringing together all the various resources.
And you might be asking, just on the Australia example, how does their overall level of investment in infrastructure as a percentage of GDP, for example, compare to ours? I mean, is it just that they have a more efficient mechanism for delivery, or do they also invest more or comparable amount? Or
I don't have the cost to hand, but they do have cost-benefit analysis undertaken of each of there's top 100. They actually have a list, page by page, the top 100 issues, and they say the greatest return on investment is number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. But actually, as to the quantum, I don't actually know the actual quantum.
Just on the housing supply issue, I think just the answer that I'd approached that conundrum and that problem with is, I think the first thing we need to do is we don't have enough land zoned. We need to reduce the price of land, and we need to increase zoned land. Obviously, there's infrastructure and service costs associated with that, but generally I think if you look back over the last 20 years, there's been a very cautious approach to public policy and planning. Obviously, we've had a lot of dysfunctionality in that period, but we do need to bring down the price of land. I mean, if healthcare in general affects the grandparents of this country, housing affects their grandchildren and their future. So we do need to do everything we can to bring in affordable rents and make housing affordable. The other thing I think we need to do is we need to have one body own the target. The country needs a national target for delivery. I mean, David talked earlier that we may need to build up to 50,000 houses per annum, and it's, when you actually look forward, and David's projections, which is based on the 2016 census that's attached to this document, to his opening statement as an appendix, is an interesting analysis, because it shows that 200 years on from the famine, we basically will need to have about the same population in the island of Ireland, but we will need 60% more houses than we have now. So I'd like to see a body such as the National Planning Regulator own the target for annual delivery of housing and be accountable for it, because I think it'll actually, you do need a planning system that works from the bottom up, but you also need a planning system that actually works from the top down. There are things on housing supply I'd like to see, just on other incentives that might actually increase supply and moderate prices. The interesting thing is the Help to Buy scheme, which I can understand commentators met with a degree of scepticism because they thought it might inflate house prices. I mean, I think the evidence would suggest that it isn't inflating house prices, it's actually increasing supply, and the average price, I think, is 375,000 or lower of people that are applying to buy houses through the scheme. So there are other things, such as, the VAT is an issue. Previously, I wouldn't have been an advocate of that, but the crisis is so great. I think if we can reduce VAT to help make housing more viable, particularly apartment building, I think the macroprudential rules set down by the Central Bank are a check on any possible inflationary aspects of that. We do need to have private, well-behaved landlords encouraged to stay in the market and to enter the market. While the interest relief initiative in the recent budget is to be welcomed, there's other things that could be done. For instance, other expenses such as property tax might be offset against income, because we do need, right around Ireland, particularly in regional Ireland, more private landlords. And there's initiatives like that, I think, would be welcome at this point. But I think we need to think bigger. I think on the Deputy's point about a cautious approach, I probably agree there is a cautious approach in public policy, and jobs has tended to be the narrative of public policy rather than housing creation the last few years, and obviously that's we need to change now. But the one thing about Brexit, if you take a very pessimistic view of Brexit, my difficulty is I think the cautious approach of public policy may get more cautious. We might miss the bigger prize. If in the year 2000 we've been able to predict what Ireland was like in 2006, we've been all the better for it. And if in 2006 we've been able to predict what 2012 would be like, we've been all the better for it. And if in 2012 we've been able to predict what 2018 would be all the better. But so I think we need to look 6 years and more hence, beyond the immediacy of Brexit, and really try and produce a country that has affordable housing for the younger generation coming through.
Did you want to just come back?
Yes, sorry, Senator, one of your questions, the skills shortage, that is a big issue for us, because it's not just bricklayers and builders, it's also the other skills that are required for the construction industry, and even things like down to planners. I lecture in the planning department occasionally and in UCD, and we went down from 50 students a year down to 5 because parents were discouraging their children to get involved in the construction industry. We also have people who might have been 48 when the recession started, might have been builders, and now they're 60. They're not going to return to the building trade. So it's a big issue to look at the skills shortage right across the construction industry, because it's one thing saying we need to build more houses, and if we get the finance right, it might be the issue that we don't have the people to build them. And we need to make sure that we have the right educational facilities in place and the right encouragement to get people back into the trades, and not just young people, but also older people who've got the skill sets, who can mentor the younger people, whether they be bricklayers or carpenters or planning consultants or architects or others, to look at it across the ages, intergenerational approach to skills shortage.
There's one other final point is that the Land Development Agency is something we very much welcome and want to work with and support, and the kind of thinking behind it that came from NESC we would concur with. We do see it very much as a social housing delivery agency that works in collaboration in conjunction with the private sector. But the one thing we need to work at as well is for house building in the private sector to increase. We need to encourage medium and small house builders to enter the market, and finance is a problem for them. And that is a significant issue, because the larger entrants to the market are to be welcomed, because they deliver capacity, deliver output. But we're not going to solve the problem with just having larger builders. We need medium to small size builders as well. And that's incredibly important. We work at that, and finance for them is a big challenge. So I think one of the things is both in the public sector and the private sector, there's probably, funny enough, a degree of conservatism that's inbuilt into both sectors due to historical reasons as a response to the crisis that we had, and something we need to work to try and ameliorate that conservatism, and for people to be a little bit more forward looking as to what needs to happen.
Just back to one of the questions the Deputy asked earlier on about the interaction. We're having very good reaction and interaction, and we always have had with the Department of Housing and Planning, and some of their officials have met us, and we meet them several times a year. When the Rebuilding Ireland document came out first, we were invited onto various committees, and along with the CIF, Property Industry Ireland was the only private sector organisation involved in it, but we were given quite a lot of consultation, and actually including in the drafting, because it was Property Industry Ireland came up with the concept of strategic housing development in the first place, and we promoted it to the then Minister Simon Coveney, and he went with it, albeit a slightly modified version, but it was PII that put forward the case, and we were listened to. And I think the issue about the them and us has largely gone. I mean, there's a lot of good collaboration between the private and public sector, and we need to encourage that, and that's the only solution, because if we've got silo thinking of the private sector or silo thinking of the public sector, it won't work. It's not only a whole of government, but it's a whole of society approach to tackling these issues.
Victor, you want to come back in?
Really, three very short follow-up questions. I suppose, David, I just want to mention, you would, in response there, talk about affordable housing supply and the impact on that. And you just tipped on something, didn't go into any great detail there in relation to the development levies. I mean, sure, you're not suggesting that in some way we were going to, I mean, there are costs to build and then there are profits for builders and developers. And we've got to clearly define the line between those. But I take it and hope that you wouldn't be suggesting any reduction in development levies. I mean, development levies are ring-fenced for specific purposes in mind, and that's not necessarily relating to the development itself, but you know how the development levy scheme works and is apportioned out. And I know people have a difficulty with it, but the other side of that, communities need, local authorities rely on development levies. And we could have a whole session about development levies and the people haven't paid the development levies. And certainly if you look at the Dublin local authorities, you'll see there are vast debts outstanding to local authorities in relation to development levies for a variety of reasons. But they're there for a purpose, and it is the common good and, you know, the overall development of sustainable communities. I think that's really important, and I think it's a tricky one, and one I would have a concern. I wouldn't like any suggestion, you know, and maybe you might just touch on that, what you had meant. Are you talking about a temporary suspension? Are you talking about various reliefs for specific projects? I'd be interested to hear what you have to say on that. In relation to Mark, you talk about not enough land zoned. I mean, I'm a councillor for many years, I was a councillor for many years in Dunleary, we were constantly being told there'd be too much land zoned. They were preventing land from being zoned. I'm talking about land that was falling between the N11 and the M50, not beyond the M50, not below there. So what we today would call major infrastructure corridors or transport corridors, places that made a lot of sense. So, I mean, I can't understand what people talk about land not. We know most local authorities, again, certainly the Dublin ones and in Galway and Cork, they have vast tracts of land. There are vast tracts of land in state ownership. And we touched on this before in terms of the portfolio, the real estate. There's a real need for an analysis, a very in-depth analysis of the real estate portfolio of the state, because clearly every day I'm at this, I'm suddenly realising that the state doesn't know its own assets. Clearly, local authorities seem to have a difficulty identifying them, state agencies have a difficulty identifying them, the department seems to have a difficulty identifying their assets. That's a real major concern. But you might just touch on it, because I don't know where you're getting this about there's not enough land zoned. We have professional planners being told there's enough. The department's telling us in certain local authorities they have more than enough land. There's a suggestion any time a councillor proposes rezoning, they're up to something shady. You know, that's the way it's gone. And we now have a situation where local authority members are finding it very difficult to propose zonings, because there's all sorts of motives attributed or attached or suggested about their commitment to see forward planning. So you might just talk briefly on that. And then finally, I'm very interested in what you have to say there, Mark, about a single body for the delivery of the social housing targets. I would have thought that would have been the department itself. I don't need to reinvent the wheel. We must ask the question, why isn't the department insisting upon that? Ultimately, they're the key department that drive this. They're the key department that come in here and go on national media and talk about rebuilding Ireland and setting their targets. See, the problem is no one's quantifying. We've no independent validation of figures and stats in relation to construction, the rollout of social, the rollout of affordable housing, or the rollout of any construction of housing. But have you anything in mind? Have you seen a model anywhere else? Or could you tease out maybe a little bit more? Because I think that makes sense. I mean, we've got to get accountability here. Why aren't we delivering? Why are we hearing day in and day out about targets, but no one's delivering them? So what sort of model, what sort of body would you be thinking about? You might just share that with us.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the answers. I suppose, Tom, my question wasn't so much about the quality of your relationship with the department, because we would hope it is the way you described, as it should be with all external bodies. It was more specifically in those conversations, have there been conversations or discussions around the contingency plans to try and deal with some of the risks we're talking about? Because while it's very important for us all to monitor those risks and be aware of, the sliding scale of risk, the real question then is for those departments and ministers who have responsibility, what contingency plans are they putting in place? With respect to the land, Mark, I suppose there are two concerns. There's a growing body of work around housing and land economists that would actually suggest that increasing the supply of land isn't going to do anything to reduce the cost of it, because the cost of land, because land is always finite, is more determined by the availability of finance and the desire of finance to seek out certain kinds of secure investments. And therefore, we could significantly increase the zoning of land and actually have the opposite effect, that you would start to push land up because speculative investment is looking for a home. And I suppose my question to you would be, is there evidence, or could you point to anything to counter that view that many economists are now making? The other problem is this. I mean, again, I'm like Victor. I'm in South Dublin County Council. We've more than enough residentially zoned land to meet current and future housing need as projected under the census targets. That's both public and private land. And in fact, if we were to accede to zoning more land in that local authority area, it would be contrary to government policy, which is about trying to focus residential development back into our town and city centres for all sorts of very positive reasons. So I'm not against zoning land if there's a credible argument for it, particularly in housing supply, but I would just caution against that. In terms of the Land Development Agency and the issue of finance, is there a concern that the government's main vehicle for addressing the need of finance for the small and medium-sized builder, the Home Building Finance Ireland, is still delayed, and we haven't seen any lending from that, because that does seem to be the kind of primary policy response. And then just, I suppose, another caution. I go back to the Institute of Chartered Surveyors of Ireland's two studies of construction and development costs. In the second one around apartments, and I know I said this in my first comment, but I'll say it again, They identified a suite of policy measures which they believe government should consider for reducing costs. If you were to introduce all of those, if you to concede every single one of those, so that's reducing car parking, reducing apartment sizes, reducing development levies, reducing VAT, reducing the cost of finance, reducing the cost of land, as they recommended it, it still wouldn't fix the viability gap that they themselves have identified in terms of the overall development costs of apartments and providing homes at affordable prices for working families. So, you know, when I hear people talk about reducing VAT, I'd be more than open to supporting it if I thought it would genuinely reduce the cost of units. But for example, in the very best case scenario, it might take 10 to 12, 18 grand at the very most off the cost of a residential unit in Dublin, a unit that's already costing 320 to 340,000. It doesn't improve its affordability for the working families who are locked out of private sector purchasing at the moment. And there's also no legally enforceable way of ensuring the developer passes that on. So you can't give a VAT reduction under EU law to prices of houses of a certain price. You can only do it, for example, for a new house versus, you know, a second-hand house. So in this committee, we look at all of the proposals, but I'm still not hearing any, I mean, other than, for example, how do we tackle the cost of land? I mean, it seems to me, unlike Victor, I'm more than happy to waive development levies if that's knocked off the purchase price of the house and somebody can buy a genuinely affordable home. That's what happened with O'Coulon and Poppintree, and it was part of the cocktail of financing that made those homes affordable. But those homes were being sold at 170 to 225,000 euros. So it's in that context that I think there's a public good to be got in return. I would have lots of sympathy with Victor if you're saying knock the development levies off the house that's 320,000, because you're only knocking 12,000 euros off the cost of the house. You're getting no public good in return. So I do think more work needs to be done from people like yourselves who are advocating cost reductions, because when you look at the detail of them, I'm not convinced they stack up. Help to Buy is the same. I would have thought a more generous interpretation of, I think it's the Indicon report, is the jury is out on whether Help to Buy has contributed to house price inflation. But even from the Indicon report, what we know is at least 60% of the people who availed of that scheme didn't need it. They already had deposits. They were already buying houses at a price that they didn't need that 5% tax refund. So I'm not convinced from the limited evidence that's out there, and it's a relatively new scheme, that either A, it contributes to affordability for those who need it, or that it hasn't contributed to house price inflation, and that's a concern as well.
I'll just make maybe a few brief comments here. And Tom said he has a very good interaction with the department and the input into rebuilding Ireland. I wonder then how the figures are so different in relation to what's required in the delivery of housing, when clearly the department is saying their figure is 25,000, where you're saying we need 36,000 and we need 50,000 in the short term, which is double their figure. So, and just on that, if that is the case, like in fairness, the government have set a target of 25,000. They're not getting anywhere close to it. So there's a deficient number of houses coming forward year on, year out, and that is going to have a huge impact into the future. And as you rightly point out, the Brexit situation is going to add to that again. But just maybe on a few specific issues, and I'll come in again. Mark, just in relation to zone land, because the regional spatial and economic strategies has just been published in relation to the Mid-East Region Authority, and we had huge problems with the department in relation, specifically in relation to population targets number 1, and then the zoning of land number 2 as a result of that. And it took a huge consultation with the department to try and get them to, and I think they issued an email to the Assembly on the Friday they published the document, saying that there was no need to downzone land. And which was a huge factor in my own county in Wicklow, because we were looking, based on the population targets they had given us, the reduction of the headroom that they had brought down, that there was going to be significant dezoning of land, and dezoning of land in areas that had the infrastructure in place that could deliver housing. And so I'm sort of sympathising with Victor on this, that, you know, there was a push in relation to regional plans to downzone land rather than zone more land, and downzone it in an area where the infrastructure was sitting. And I gave the example of Wicklow Town, where we invested 100 million into infrastructure, and now we were being told that, by the way, you're only getting a population growth of the following, and you should be downzoning land. But in fairness, the department at the last minute have counteracted that. Just in relation to the whole area of the cost of building and affordability, and I know in relation to, Victor mentioned levies, and of course social housing doesn't attract any levies in the first place, so it doesn't apply to social housing. But what Victor did say something which I found a bit worrying is in relation to the collection of levies, and I would have done significant work on this in Wicklow. And we have a system in place where the council just do not sign off on the planning or occupation up until the levies have been paid. Just in relation to VAT, as a benefactor of the VAT decrease in the tourism sector myself, I have to say at the time it was introduced, it made my business viable, which I would have to question whether I would have survived the crash without the VAT decrease at that time. So, Mark, are you saying the reduction in VAT is on a viable basis, or are you saying that is on creating and making it more affordable? Because in fairness to housing, I suppose it's demand-led. So, you know, the greater demand, the higher the price. So to the purchaser of the house, the VAT really doesn't make an impact when there's a high demand. But to the deliverer, to the person who's building that house, that reduction from 13.5% to 9%, that 4.5% margin, I know the impact it had on my business and how it made my business get through the crisis. And in relation, maybe not in relation to the large developers, but when you mentioned the small and medium-sized construction companies who cannot afford, get access to any credit, and if they're building outside Dublin, they're having a hope. And we've towns and villages throughout the country who could be delivering 20 or 30 houses tomorrow morning. If small and medium-sized contractors could, one, get access to credit and could increase their margin to make it more viable. So just on the VAT issue, are you saying you would look at a reduction in VAT from a viable point of view as opposed to an affordability point of view? Just them few points.
Significant interaction on what measures are needed to address the issues in the housing market, but not in a Brexit-related contingency fashion. I think we're also concerned that the House Building Finance Ireland has been. We still haven't seen that come to the market, because I think the point you make is correct, that we also do need the small and medium-sized builders in the market. There's no one solution in terms of it just being large-scale developments. The small, medium-sized builders do have a role to play in delivering. They'll be smaller sites, but they are delivering houses into the market, which is important. Again, I think the issue of the measures that are needed to improve the cost of delivery, I think the surveyor's report did show and illustrate quite well that there isn't a silver bullet. You can't pick one thing, and that it is a range of measures across the funding, the finance, etc., and the cost of land, and you need to address all of those to try and address the issue of viability and the cost of delivery. With regard to the Help to Buy scheme, I think in a market like the housing market, which is very much sentiment driven, I think it is playing an important role in terms of giving more confidence about the demand levels that are there. And as a result of confidence about the demand, that is then resulting in confidence about supply. So that from the home builder's perspective, because they know there is demand there, they are prepared to deliver houses. And I think one of the impacts has been in terms of the acceleration of delivery, that moving from phase 1 to phase 2 has been quicker because of that. The other impact of it, which I hadn't thought about, but which I heard through interaction with some of our members, is that certainty of demand has also brought about more certainty of funding, and that certainty of funding has helped delivering supply. So I think the Help to Buy scheme, even though it could be viewed as a demand side measure, is probably having more of an impact on the supply side through bringing that certainty, and has had a significant impact in terms of helping deliver supply. In terms of the population projections, I think there's probably a number of reasons for the difference. Probably the 25,000 estimate was probably based off the 2011 census. the numbers that we've done, the 36,000 is based off the 2016 census. So it's probably just the passage of time between the preparation of the two different sets of estimates. And I think I'll maybe pass over to Tom to deal with some of the other ones.
Thank you. Just on the issue, Senator, on the issue of levies, we're not looking for a blanket omission of levies. We're just asking for an equitable amount of levies, because you've got 31 planning authorities in the country and 31 different sets of levies. So you could have different sides of a road, like say Walkinstown roundabout in Dublin has two different authorities either side of the road. So if you built a house here or a house here or an apartment here and an apartment here, they're going to have different levies, and those levies are passed on to the purchaser. That's the problem. The developer has to make a margin of profit in order to get bank finance, and he or she will not get 100% bank finance like they did in the past. They'll only get a certain quantum. So any levies that are applied by the local authority end up going onto the cost of a house. And another thing, Deputy, as well, it's not just a matter of €13,000 reduction. That the levies are, it's 13.5%, so €300,000 house is nearly 40,000 of a VAT levy on a house. So all this money adds to the cost of housing, makes housing more expensive. So what we would advocate is a holistic one look at all the 31 authorities and to see, is it equitable among the various different authorities, the quantum. For example, in your own authority, if you look at Dún Laoghaire down, where you used to be a councillor, with the levies for Kiltern and Glenamuck, at one stage it was nearly €60,000 for an apartment to build in Glenamuck. So you've got to buy the land, get your finance from the bank, pay your team to do it, get the builders to build it, etc., etc., etc. And then on top of it all, pay €60,000 to the local authority per unit to build the house. So it rendered it non-viable. Nothing happened. So it's the whole. And in the UK, they have a system, the Harman report, about the viability testing of local area plans and the viability testing of plans. We don't do it in this country because for a long time the planning system set aside the issue of economics and only looked at the social and the physical side of it. But all three are legs of the same stool, that we've got to look at how we deliver housing, and that we do have an eye on the market, because without the market does inform how we should be doing policies. And I think the planning system has its eyes closed to a degree to the market. And we need to see how can we make it viable and look at all these costs and look at all these levers and say, if we just reduce that for a while or omit it for a while, what effect will it have?
Sorry, just to check, have you done a paper on that? Are you working on something?
We are working on it.
You might just keep us informed as a committee, because it's an interesting proposition.
Okay. Yep.
Just if I could come in just on a few of those points. I suppose, you know, I mean, obviously we represent an industry, and, you know, this organisation came about because of the awful crisis there was, and it was a response to it. But, you know, so you do go through the red door and say you've got something to declare if you're part of an industry, and that's self-apparent. But I do think that where we are trying to attempt to come from, very much so, is in the public good. And I suppose the context, the way we're approaching this problem, is that we're looking backwards, and we don't only look backwards for reasons to learn what we should do in the future. Probably, I think it was about the 1971 census, when we had about 700,000 houses in Ireland. And with David's figures, we have about 1.7 million occupied houses in Ireland at the moment. And if you take David's figures, we go to 2.8 million. So we're really saying in the next 25 to 30 years, we need to see as much change in housing in Ireland as we have in the last nearly 50 years. So that's the context of the sort of proposed initiatives we're suggesting. Philosophically, you know, looking at the public good, I think at the moment we probably have a policy of controlled containment. I think what we probably need is a policy of controlled enablement. And on the zone land issue, in terms of, you know, why you should zone more land. I mean, there is actually international research, which I can share with you, fairly good international research that studied many global cities from a New Zealand body that shows that zoning more land actually does work. So it's actually, I think, an 80-page document. It's worth reading because it does hopefully answer some of the questions you're talking about. But if I was to look, you know, even backwards for 5 years ago, I think in the end of 2012, PI were asked by the Secretary General of the Government to attend a meeting with representatives of NAM and local authorities about the housing crisis that was emerging. But it wasn't perceived to be this crisis than it is now, but it was emerging. And at the time, the Minister of State had made a speech about saying exactly we have enough land zone to build. And what we actually did in advance of that meeting was we actually went around Dublin and went to look at every scheme, what we thought we could get built the following year. In other words, the theory and the reality, and we turned up at the meeting and showed that's your theory, but this is the reality of what's going to be built. And unfortunately, what we predicted actually came to pass. And so when you talk about we have enough land zoned, I mean, just to give you an example, at the time, I think part of the official figures was they could build 2,000 houses in 2012, 2013 in Adamstown. Now, it wasn't possible to physically build 2,000 houses in 2013 in Adamstown, and if you did, you wouldn't be able to sell them. So that's the kind of thing where the difference in theory and reality. So you do have to look. I mean, I suppose what we're interested in doing is bringing the price of land down because we think it'll bring the price of housing down. If a profit is going to be made in the private sector, I think it's probably more in the public good that the profit is made on the building of the house rather than on the land. I think we probably all agree on that. In terms of the owning a target, well, we do live in a world where people have to take responsibility, and people who take responsibility need to be held to account, and the people who do the holding account need to behave responsibly. So I really don't mind who owns the target, but my point is somebody should own the target. The reason why I mentioned the National Planning Regulator was, I felt like what the NRA was. The NRA has been quite, well, I know it's called a different name now, but it's been quite successful in terms of owning something, delivering something, so somebody has to own it.
So are you suggesting the National Planning Regulator is potentially somebody?
Potentially somebody that could own
okay.
it, but the department could own it as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
One of the same.
On the VAT issue in terms of viability and affordability, I suppose my point is if we've a major problem. We need to build a lot of apartments in our cities, and there is a problem in our cities about the viability of apartments. But why is there a problem? Because the land prices are high, the construction costs are complicated, and compliance, which is part and parcel of and rightly so, of modern day building costs money. So we need to make those apartments more viable. My point is if you bring down the VAT, particularly on apartments, it will help make them more viable. If you build more apartments, it will then make them more affordable. That's the theory of it. I think it would turn into reality. I suppose they're the response to the questions you raised.
Yeah, just I suppose a small follow-on, and it's more to do with the economics of land. Like if we look at land markets, for example, whether it's in European or OECD countries over the last 30, 40, 50 years, the less taxes we placed on land and the less restrictive markets in land were, the greater price rises and price volatility. And it seems to me that one of the things we've forgotten is part of the reason why we have, for example, development levies, and development levies as distinct from VAT, is it's a way, first of all, of the local authority and therefore the population in general capturing some of the land increase or the value increase in land that comes from everything surrounding it. But there is also a value in thinking about how we constrain the rising values of land. And I suppose my worry is that, I mean, if you take Adamstown as the example and Clonburris beside it, we've no shortage of residentially zoned land. Our difficulty was either lack of finance or lack of purchasers because of lack of income to meet the cost of. And part of the difficulty in those areas is land prices. I mean, we have a situation where a very significant developer has bought a very large piece of agriculturally zoned land in the same local authority just across the road from Clonburris and Adamstown. And the argument will be, oh, well, this is about increasing the supply. Whereas what we're going to see is the value of that land and therefore the ultimate price of the houses is actually going to rise, not reduce, if that land is rezoned. And that's not an argument against zoning. It's just, I think one of the bits of our economy we understand least is land. I think we've lost the ability to understand what actually influences the price. And it's the same with supply. Like, there's growing bodies of evidence that show increasing the supply of housing in and of itself doesn't reduce the cost, because the cost of housing units isn't just determined by the number of buyers, it's also determined by the cost of land, the cost of finance, etc. And we know from the Celtic Tiger period, when housing output was at the very highest in the history of the state, the number of families on the local authority waiting list, the number of families dependent on subsidised private rental accommodation also dramatically increased. Why? Because despite the fact that we were producing between 60 and 90,000 houses over 3 years, the prices of housing, both in terms of renting and buying, also increased. So I'm not saying supply isn't important. I'm just saying the simplified idea that just increasing the supply as a result of making it more viable for developers will automatically result in affordability, I think is flawed. And I think we need a more informed debate about how we make sure not only we increase supply, but at the same time we increase affordability. Because here's the problem. If we don't do that, then the other section of the organisation that you guys work for will have a different problem, which is because they can't get affordable housing, they'll be demanding increased wages, and that's going to affect the viability of businesses and the competitiveness of the economy as well. And I think that's why, some of these debates just are too limited. Pat is right. Reducing VAT does increase the viability of the development. Of course it does, because if you knock 10 or 15,000 euros off the VAT of that 320,000 euro price, that goes into the pocket of the developer. And in fairness, if that's the way the developer plays the reduction. And in fairness to Central Bank and some of the larger banks, when they've advocated this, they've advocated it as a supply viability measure, not as an affordability measure. I suppose my concern is if we keep reducing the ability of the state to invest in the infrastructure that people need around those houses by reducing the tax take, and at the same time there's no increase in affordability, that's not a good deal for the public overall. While it might be a good deal for individual developers and increased supply, it's not necessarily the kind of supply that we need.
Just on that, Deputy, just the way I see the way the market works, the way different markets intersect with each other. So just give you a practical example. If we were to build, if the country were to build more houses in Naas, the increase in supply in houses in Naas has the impact of making houses in the ring road of Dublin a bit more affordable because people have an option that bit further out. And then if you keep the houses in the ring road more affordable, it means that when you go to develop, which is instead of having very expensive houses in the inner city where we want to try and develop, the ring road, the price of the ring road, because it'll be an option for people, will keep that price of the inner city more honest. So this, how the markets intersect with each other is very, very important. I don't think public policy quite gets that. I do accept the fact that there is a risk that if you do increase zoning, that it can, in certain services, if not managed properly, have inflationary impacts. But as against that, when I started taking interest in housing when I was about 15 years of age in the early 70s, or late 60s, early 70s, when I used to look at the evening press, it was full of ads for houses all over, and that the price of a house, whether it was in Ballincollig in Cork or Salthill in Galway or Lucan in Dublin, was more or less the same. And there was a lot of supply because the land was zoned. Now, maybe the process wasn't what it should be, but there was a lot of choice, a lot of supply. And actually the market at that stage worked, and people were able to go out and set up house and get a mortgage and have a family and buy a house. One way to I think to help manage, if you are to zone more land, is to do it in a clever way, that you set your development plan. And then if somebody comes with a business case to say there's 10 or 20 or 30 acres which I think aren't zoned, but the serves are nearby, and I think they could be zoned, and you provided the process is the way it should be, you put a business case, it means that there's a little bit of flexibility that yes, we'll give the zoning because there's a logic to it, but what it'll do is it'll actually impact the inflation on the other pieces of land and the contiguous area around it. That's the way it should work. So it's the way it's managed, I think, is important. And it is quite difficult in a public process system to actually manage markets in an efficient and ethical way. I accept that, but that to me would be a reasonably clever and adroit way to go about increasing land supply without necessarily inflating it, with achieving the objective of actually helping to reduce the price of land.
Just, I suppose I might have a few comments just in relation to the zoning and the zoning of land. I think once you zone a land, it's what happens from the time it's zoned till it's actually completed. And, if a land was zoned tomorrow morning and it was constructed on immediately, it probably wouldn't have the same cost as what's happening at the moment, because land is zoned and then it's flipped so many times by the time that land is actually developed out. The single cost of a housing unit on it just escalates, because either you get planning permission on it and that ups the value of it, and it's flipped, and the next one gets, and so I think while I would agree that there does need to be looked at the zoning of land, is how we develop that zoned land, and whether we put time frames on it or we put significant penalties on it if all you're doing is flipping it as opposed to building it out. And just in relation to the development levies, I would have to say I would have some sympathy with what you're saying here, because you have so many local authorities with different development contribution schemes, all based on different infrastructure that they have put in their county development plan. And the process was started, we're currently dealing with in 2004. And what it identified was a huge historical lack of infrastructure that it was trying to make up for, plus deal with future infrastructure that was required, which led to significant, like in Wicklow, if you're building in Greystones or Wicklow Town, you're looking at 25,000 development levies. That's because we were trying to deal with historical deficiencies in infrastructure and then plan for the future. But we also put in crazy infrastructure projects that were never going to happen in our lifetime, and we're asking that development plan to deliver them. So there's just a few points on that.
I just think on the land front again, just, you know, one of the reasons why land prices go up is because the market, the people who are buying the land, bet on dysfunctionality. You know, so they actually don't think the housing is going to be delivered. So, you know, if you increase the supply of land, they're then in a situation there's more competition. The land that they own is less scarce. And what we need to do when you're zoning more land, if you adopt that policy in tandem with that, you need to make sure, parallel to that, you're actually increasing housing supply, and that the policy is cohesive and coherent. If you do that, then you'll achieve what you set out to achieve. If you don't approach such a policy in a coherent way, you know, it could have unintended consequences. But right now, what's actually happening is we're not building the houses, and the price of land is going up. So what we're doing at the moment isn't working. So I'm suggesting we need to do more of a controlled enablement policy rather than, as I say, a controlled containment policy.
I suppose we drifted off the topic that we probably came in here to discuss, which was the impact of Brexit on the housing market. And it just shows the level of interest that we actually all have in the room to try and deal with different scenarios. So can I just take this opportunity to thank you all for coming in today, Mark, David and Tom, and for engaging with the committee. And the committee will publish a report in the near future. This meeting is now adjourned, and the next meeting of the Joint Committee will be held on Thursday, the 22nd of November at 9:30, Residential Tenancy Students' Rents, Rights and Protection Bill 2018. Thank you all again.